We're talking in these lessons about the providence of God, and in the first lesson, 2 lessons back, I talked about what the providence of God is not, and what the reformed understanding of the providence of God rejects, namely deism, astrology, and fatalism. Then in the next lesson, gave a more positive view of what the providence of God is. It is that God upholds and governs all things. Now, in this lesson, I'm going to speak about how God even knows how to use the evil actions of men for His good purposes. And we're going to look at the narrative about Joseph, first of all, and then about Jesus. So if you look in Genesis, this is the first text that we want to look at, Genesis 45, verse 7. So if you just take a look at that in the Bible, actually verse 7 and 8. Verse 7 and 8. So the context is that Joseph's brothers had sold him into slavery, had sold him to Midianite traders, and Joseph had ended up in Egypt. And of course we can't go into the whole history. You might want to read the early chapters about the history of Joseph. As it turns out, Joseph becomes sort of the prime minister of Egypt. And there's a universal famine going on at this time. And Joseph, through brilliant agricultural and financial policies, makes Egypt very prosperous. Basically, Egypt is the only country in the ancient Near East that has food. So one day, these brothers show up. They've sold Joseph years and years ago, and they're still in the land of Canaan. Okay, and they're running out of food, so the brothers come to Egypt to buy food. To take back to their families. And their old father Jacob has sent them. Jacob, also the father of Joseph. 12 sons, remember, 12 sons. And then, as it turns out, the day comes that the brothers end up before Joseph. And they appeal to Joseph for some food. And Joseph recognizes them. And he then, as the story goes, the twists and turns of the story, he reveals himself to them. And they, of course, become very scared because, just think about it, they've sold their little kid brother, into slavery because they didn't like him. You remember that Joseph was a little bit of a braggart and conceited. Remember, perhaps you remember that. So they sold him, and but now the little kid brother that they sold has become the prime minister of Egypt, basically the most powerful man in the world at that time. So they become very scared, and then Joseph says to them, tells them not to be afraid. He says, God sent me ahead of you. I'm reading Genesis 45:7. God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me, but God. But God. That's how Joseph, that was his experience, that it was God who had sent them. Then Jacob and his family's about 70 strong, 70 people. They move to Egypt, and Father Jacob becomes very, very old, and then Jacob dies, and then now we're at Genesis 50, verse 20. Jacob dies. Okay, Jacob dies. So the brothers they become worried now. They say, now that Jacob has died, that father Jacob has died, now surely Joseph will get his revenge. But then Joseph says, he says, am I in the place of God? And then he says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. So the 11 brothers, no, not Benjamin, the 10 brothers, 10 older brothers, 10 brothers, they sold, they meant harm. They meant to harm Joseph when they sold him into slavery. But God intended it for good. So God used the evil actions of the brothers for good. And God can do that. God for good. Okay? God knows how to do that. Now, the outstanding example of this in the New Testament is in the life of Jesus. And take a look in your Bible at Mark, Gospel according to Mark 14 at verse 21. Mark 14:21, where Jesus says, Mark 14:21, Jesus says, the Son of Man will go just as it is written about him, but woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would have been better for him had he not been born. So he's talking about Judas, right? Judas betrayed Jesus. Judas betrayed Jesus. Right? But it was according to the plan of God. It was all according to the plan of God. God had said in the Old Testament that this is going to happen. Many texts in the Old Testament spoke about this, and it happened according to the plan of God. And yet, Jesus says, woe. Woe to Judas. So, from this, we learn that, I'm just going to scan down here a little bit. Okay. We come here across, we come up against here the mystery of the sovereignty of God. God is absolutely sovereign. Sovereignty of God. And at the same time, the full responsibility of man. It's a mystery, right? But we see it here. The brothers of Joseph were fully responsible for what they did, and what they did was wrong. And yet God, in His sovereignty, used that wrong action of the brothers for good. And again, with the same with Jesus. What Judas did was wrong, and he's culpable for it. But it was all according to the sovereign plan of God. And how exactly this can be reconciled? Well, we ought not to try reconcile it. God knows how it works. God knows the connection between His sovereignty and our full responsibility. But it's sometimes a mystery to us. Other passage that I can mention, which speak about the that. So let me get the text down here. Acts 2:22 and 23, and also Acts 4:27 and 28. Those texts say the same thing, that the Pontius Pilate, King Herod, and the people of Israel, the Jews and the Gentiles, they were responsible and culpable for killing Jesus, the author of life, but it was all according to the good providence of God. God knows how to use the evil actions of men for His good, and He even controls, and He's always governing, even when people are doing evil things. And as we see in these examples, God is working out His good plan. And that's a huge comfort for us as God's people, knowing that all things, all creatures are so completely in His hand that without His will, they cannot even so much as move. And that is the real comfort of the Reformed teaching, the biblical teaching of the providence of God.